The stone hall smelled of burning pine and melted wax. Annie entered through the side door without announcing herself, because there was never anyone to announce her. She carried a wicker basket covered with a rough linen cloth, inside which rested fresh herb poultices, strips of clean bandaging, and a small vial of cedar oil. She had pressed herself that morning. The corridor leading to the inner courtyard of the stronghold was long and cold, with torches spaced along the stone walls, casting long shadows across the uneven floor. She knew every stone of that path. She had walked that corridor hundreds of times over the past 4 years, always carrying something: medicine, food, compresses, always for someone no one else wanted to tend to. She was not a warrior. She was not the daughter of any alpha, carried no blood from any notable lineage. She was Annie, the healer from the edge of town, the woman the wolves called when the court physicians had already given up. That night, they called her to the servants' courtyard. The messenger had been too brief. There is a cub. Came in wounded from the northern side. No one knows whose he is. Probably won't survive the night. Annie had not asked questions. She took the basket, pulled her cloak over her shoulders, and went. The courtyard was nearly empty when she arrived. 2 servants stepped back when they saw her enter, too relieved to pretend they had been helping. In the farthest corner, near the wall where the wind did not hit directly, there was a pile of straw covered by an old mantle, and on top of the straw, curled and motionless, was the cub. Annie knelt down. He was too small for his age. She estimated around 8 years, perhaps 9, from the bone structure beneath the skin. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and dried blood, and there was a deep cut along the left side of his chest that had already begun to inflame. His breathing came in short, uneven pieces. His eyes were closed, but his eyelids trembled as though he was dreaming of something that hurt. She set the basket down carefully. "Hey," she said quietly, not expecting an answer. "I'm here." It was not for him. It was what she always said. When she arrived somewhere, a person was too alone. She worked in silence for a long time. She cleaned the wound with hot water that one of the servants brought without her needing to ask twice. She applied a poultice of cedar root and crushed eucalyptus leaf, pressing firmly to stop what was still bleeding beneath the surface of the flesh. Her hands did not shake. They never shook. It was the one thing about herself that Annie considered sometimes a virtue. The cub whimpered when she tightened the bandage around his torso. "I know," she murmured. "It's going to hurt a little more before it gets better." That's the arrangement. He did not wake, but his breathing slowed slightly, became a little less desperate. That was when she did what she always did, without thinking, without calculating, because it was simply what Annie did when someone was suffering and there was nothing more practical to be done. She leaned forward, rested her forehead briefly against the boy's dark hair, and then pressed her lips lightly to his brow. It was not a mother's kiss, not a relative's kiss. It was the gesture of someone saying without words, "You are not alone in this hour. You're going to be all right," she whispered against his hair. "I promise." She had not noticed the silence. Not the ordinary silence of the courtyard late at night, that she knew well. This was a different silence, the kind that comes before something. The kind in which the air stops moving. Annie straightened slowly, reaching for the extra bandage strip in the basket, and it was only then that she saw it. The spear had fallen. She had not heard the sound. She should have. Iron against stone makes noise, but perhaps she had been too focused to register it. The spear lay on the courtyard floor 3 meters from her, its tip sunk slightly between 2 stones, the shaft still swaying faintly as though it had only just been released. And the man who had released it was standing at the entrance of the courtyard. Annie recognized him. It was impossible not to. His portrait hung in every hall of the stronghold, on every banner that shifted in the wind above the towers, the angular face, the amber eyes dark enough to seem to hold their own light even at a distance, the black hair pulled back with controlled carelessness. Caius, the Alpha King, the Lord of 6 Packs, the man who had reunified the northern clans 12 years ago in a single 3-month war, the Alpha whose roar, they said, shook the stones of enemy castles. He was standing in the servants' courtyard, without armor, wearing only a dark tunic and a cloak over his shoulders, and he was looking at her with an expression Annie did not know how to name. It was not anger. It was not exactly surprise. It was something between the two, or perhaps neither, and there was something beneath it she could not read. Behind him, 2 men. She recognized them as well, the king's brothers. Dorian, the elder of the two, with a smile that always seemed to arrive before the thought that caused it, and Soren, the youngest, taller than both of them, with an old scar crossing his jaw and his eyes narrowed in something that could be assessment or could be danger. It was difficult to know with Soren. None of the 3 said anything for a moment. It was Dorian who broke the silence, and he did it the only way Dorian knew how to do anything, with enough irony to cut stone. "Well," he said slowly, glancing from the fallen spear to Annie and back to Caius. "That's new." Caius did not respond. He kept his eyes on Annie. She rose fully, still holding the bandage strip, and realized her heart had accelerated in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It had to do with the weight of that gaze, with the quality of it, as though he was seeing something in her that she herself had not placed there. "Who are you?" Caius's voice was lower than she expected. It was not the roar of the stories. It was calibrated, precise, the kind of voice that did not need volume to make an entire room stop breathing. "Annie," she answered, and her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm the healer. They sent for me for the cub." Caius descended the 2 courtyard steps slowly. Each step was deliberate in a way Annie could not quite explain. It was not a threat, but it was not indifference either. It was the movement of someone accustomed to the world rearranging itself around their steps. He stopped 1.5 meters from her and looked down at the cub. Something shifted in his face. Annie saw it. She could not have missed it. A small tightening around the eyes, a brief tension in the jaw, which disappeared so quickly she almost doubted it had existed. "How is he?" Caius asked, still looking at the boy. "Stable now." The wound inflamed, but it didn't reach the lung. With 2 days of rest and the poultices changed every 8 hours, he will survive. "You're certain?" The question was not a challenge. It was the question of someone who genuinely needed certainty. "I am," Annie said. "I've seen worse wounds walk out on their own." Caius finally turned his gaze to her. Up close, the amber eyes were more complex. There was gold in them, and deep brown, and something pulsing beneath everything like an ember that does not go out. "Why did you do that?" he asked. Annie blinked. "Do what? Heal the boy?" "That too." A small pause, and then the kiss on his forehead. Heat rose on Annie's neck before she could stop it. "It's what I do when someone is frightened and alone. It's nothing. It's just, no one does that with an alpha's son." Soren spoke from the courtyard entrance, his voice flat and direct as a knife blade. "Let alone a king's." Annie went still. "I didn't know who he was." "Exactly," said Caius. And there was something in that single word that Annie could not fully unwrap, as though her ignorance of it was, to him, the most important answer she could have given. Dorian stepped closer with his hands clasped behind his back, and the slightly crooked smile that had probably conquered and ruined an irresponsible number of hearts. He looked at Annie with the kind of attention that seemed light, but wasn't. "She smells different," he said to Caius, as though Annie were not standing there, then turned the smile on her. "No offense. Just an observation. Thank you," Annie said, dry. Dorian appeared to find that amusing. Caius crouched beside the cub. He stayed there a moment, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, and Annie saw again that small contraction in his face, that thing he did not allow to last more than a second. "Will you stay with him tonight?" he asked without turning to her. "If it's necessary, yes, it's necessary." It was not a request, but neither was it an order in the way orders usually sound. It was more like someone stating something that needed to be said, and trusting that the other person would understand the weight of it. Annie pulled a low stool from against the wall and sat beside the straw pile, rearranging the vials in her basket. The cold courtyard wind smelled of pine and wet earth. Caius stood, held his gaze on her for one more second. A long second, the kind people usually avoid because it lasts too long to be polite, and then turned and left the courtyard with both brothers behind him. The spear remained on the ground. Annie stared at it for a long moment, then looked at the cub sleeping with more regular breath now, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm she had fought to restore. She did not know who the boy was. She did not know why the Alpha King had dropped his spear. She did not know what had been in his eyes when they settled on her in that cold courtyard. But she knew, with the same certainty with which she knew the cub would survive, that something had begun in that courtyard that had not finished yet. She tucked the mantle more closely around the boy and stayed awake until dawn. Morning came slowly to the stronghold, the way it always did in the cold months, a pale gray light that crept through the narrow courtyard openings before the sun had fully committed to rising. Annie had not slept. She had dozed twice, briefly, her back against the stone wall and her chin dropping toward her chest before the cub's restless movements pulled her back. By the time the first servants began crossing the yard with water pails and firewood, she had already changed the poultice twice and coaxed the boy into drinking a small cup of willow bark tea that he took without opening his eyes. His fever had broken just before dawn. She had felt it the moment it happened, the sudden softening of the heat under her palm when she checked his forehead, the way his breathing shifted from labored to merely tired. She allowed herself one long exhale and then went back to work. She was rewrapping the bandage for the third time when she heard footsteps behind her, not a servant's footsteps. Servants moved quickly and apologetically in the corridors of the stronghold, always slightly sideways, always giving space. These footsteps were even and unhurried, the steps of someone who had never needed to apologize for taking up room. She did not turn around immediately. "The fever broke," she said, keeping her eyes on the knot she was tying. "He's still weak, but the worst is over." A pause. Then, "You knew it was me without looking." "Your footsteps are different from everyone else's in this building," Annie said simply. She finished the knot and sat back on the stool. Only then did she look up. Caius stood a few feet away, and in the gray morning light he looked less like a portrait and more like a person, which somehow made him harder to look at, not easier. He had changed clothes from the night before. A gray tunic now, the cloak gone. A dark leather vest laced across the chest. There were faint shadows under his eyes that suggested he had not slept either, though he carried it the way men like him carried everything, as though it were simply weather, unremarkable. He looked at the boy for a long moment before he looked at her. "His name is Eli," Caius said. "He is 8 years old." Annie waited. "He is my brother's son. My brother died 14 months ago." His voice did not change when he said it. It stayed level and quiet. "Eli has been in the care of the court physicians since then. They moved him 3 times in 4 months. Each time he got worse." Annie looked down at the sleeping boy. Eli. 8 years old, dark hair like his uncle, small hands curled loosely against the edge of the mantle. "Who brought him to the servants' courtyard?" she asked. "He brought himself. He does that. He slips away from wherever they put him. Last night he made it further than usual and took a fall on the northern slope." A pause. "One of the stable hands found him and sent for you before sending for the court physicians. Why?" "Because the stable hand said the court physicians make him cry." Something moved briefly across Caius's expression, too fast to identify. "You apparently do not." Annie was quiet for a moment. Outside, the courtyard was beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of morning. Boots on stone, the low exchange of voices, the distant clang of the smithy starting early. "He's going to need more than poultices," she said. "The wound will close, but he's undernourished, and the recurring fevers have weakened his base. Someone needs to be consistent with him. Same person, same routine, same voice when he wakes up afraid." Caius looked at her steadily. "Are you saying the court physicians are not sufficient?" "I'm saying consistency matters more than credentials sometimes." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not criticizing your physicians. I'm telling you what the boy needs." Another silence. This one had a different texture than the silences from the night before. Less unreadable. More deliberate. "I want you in the stronghold," Caius said. "Assigned to Eli. Permanently, until he is fully recovered." Annie blinked. "I have other patients. People outside the walls who depend on. They will be compensated. Your other arrangements will be honored." He said it without dismissiveness, as a matter of logistics already decided. "You will have a room in the East Wing, full access to the herb stores, and whatever else you require. I will have it arranged this morning." She stared at him. You're not asking. No, he said, but I would like you to agree. There was a difference, and they both knew it. He could have simply ordered it. He had not. Annie looked at Eli again, at the rise and fall of his small chest, at the dried tear tracks still faintly visible on his cheeks from the night before. All right, she said. The East Wing room was larger than her entire cottage outside the walls. She stood in the doorway for a moment when the servant showed her in, taking in the stone fireplace already lit, the wooden bed with actual linen sheets, the window that looked out over the courtyard and the pine forest beyond the stronghold walls. Her basket sat on the floor beside her feet, looking very small. Is it acceptable? The servant asked, clearly uncertain what expression Annie's face was making. It's fine, she said. It's more than fine. She had barely begun to unpack when Mara arrived. Mara was the only person in the world who addressed Annie with the same tone she had used since they were children, slightly exasperated, deeply affectionate, and always slightly too loud for the situation. She was shorter than Annie by half a head, and wider at the shoulders, with braided red hair, and the look of someone who had never once in her life been intimidated by a room she walked into. She appeared in the doorway, took one look at the room, one look at Annie, and said, "What did you do?" "I healed a child." And apparently that is enough to get a room in the East Wing. Mara stepped inside and closed the door behind her with the careful deliberateness of someone who wanted to make sure no one in the corridor heard what came next. She lowered her voice by approximately half a degree, which for Mara was a significant concession. "Annie, people are talking in the lower hall already. They're saying the Alpha King himself came to the servants' courtyard last night. They're saying he dropped his spear." She paused. "His spear, Annie. Do you understand what that means?" "It means he was surprised by something," Annie said, refolding a cloth that did not need refolding. "An Alpha does not drop his weapon by accident." Mara's voice carried the weight of someone who had grown up in pack territory and absorbed its codes the way other people absorbed weather. It means something moved him, something disrupted his control. Alphas like Caius do not lose control. He didn't lose control. He set the spear down. He dropped it. Annie put the cloth down. "Mara." "I'm just telling you what it means," Mara said, holding up both hands. "I'm not telling you what to do about it. I'm only telling you that you walked into a courtyard with a basket of herbs and somehow made the most controlled man in 6 territories drop a weapon he has probably been holding since he was 14, and that is not nothing." Annie was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the pine forest was just visible above the stronghold wall, dark and still in the morning gray. "I kissed a sick child's forehead," she said. "That's all I did." "That's all you think you did," Mara said, softer now. She came and stood beside Annie at the window, their shoulders almost touching, the way they had stood together since they were small. "You know what I see? Don't. I see someone who has spent 4 years giving everything she has to people who will never be able to give anything back. I see someone who never asks what something costs before she gives it." A pause. "And apparently, so does he." Annie did not answer. Below, in the courtyard, 2 guards were crossing the yard in the direction of the east gate. One of them glanced up briefly at the East Wing window, then away again. "I just need to make sure the boy heals," Annie said finally. Mara nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she disagreed, but had decided not to press. "And after the boy heals?" she asked. Annie did not have an answer for that. She met Dorian in the corridor outside the herb stores that afternoon, which she suspected was not entirely accidental. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had been waiting with great patience and equal amusement, and he straightened when he saw her with a slight incline of his head that managed to be simultaneously respectful and teasing. "The healer," he said. "How is the East Wing treating you?" "Well enough," she said. "Excuse me." "He asked about you this morning," Dorian said, before she could pass, before the War Council, before the messenger reports, before breakfast. He let that settle for a second. That's not a usual sequence for him. Annie stopped. "What did he ask?" "Whether you had settled in, whether you had everything you needed." Dorian's smile arrived in stages, unhurried, He asked Soren to make sure the herb stores were fully stocked before you went looking. Soren, who has never voluntarily entered the herb stores in his life, spent 40 minutes in there this morning counting dried root bundles. Annie stared at him. "I'm not telling you this to flatter you," Dorian said, and his voice had dropped the teasing edge, just for a moment. "I'm telling you because my brother has not asked about anyone like that in a very long time, and I think you should know the weight of the ground you're standing on." He pushed off the wall, gave her another slight nod, and walked away down the corridor with his hands in his pockets. Annie stood still for a moment in the dim hallway, the smell of dried herbs drifting from the storeroom behind the half-open door. Then she went in and began to take stock of what she had to work with. Eli woke on the second day, not gradually, the way most patients surfaced from deep fever, confused and slow, reaching for faces they recognized. He opened his eyes all at once, looked directly at Annie and said, "You're still here." "I said I would be," she answered, not looking up from the poultice she was preparing at the small table beside his bed. They had moved him to a proper room in the east wing the previous morning, closer to the herb stores and warmer than the servants' courtyard by a significant margin. He was propped against 2 pillows now, the bandage clean, and the color returned to his face in thin, cautious increments. "The other ones always said that," Eli said. "They never were." Annie set down the mortar and looked at him properly. "I'm not the other ones." He considered her for a moment with the particular gravity that children sometimes have, the kind that makes adults feel briefly evaluated. Then he said, "You kissed my forehead." "I did." "Why?" "Because you were alone and frightened, and that seemed like the right thing to do." She brought the fresh poultice to the bedside and began unwrapping the old bandage with practiced hands. "Hold still." He held still. He winced once when she pressed the compress to the wound, but did not make a sound, which told her something about what kind of 8 years he had lived through. "My uncle came," Eli said, after a moment. "I know. I met him. He doesn't come usually. To the physician's rooms, I mean." A pause. "He came twice yesterday." "I was asleep both times, but Bren told me. Bren is the guard outside my door. He tells me things." Annie rewrapped the bandage without commenting on this. Outside the window the morning was sharper than the day before, the sky a hard pale blue above the pine line, frost still visible on the inner courtyard stones. "Is he frightening?" Eli asked. "My uncle. People always act frightened around him." Annie considered the question honestly. "He's very still," she said finally. "Still things can seem frightening when you're not used to them." "Are you frightened of him?" "No." Eli seemed to find this interesting. He looked at her with those evaluating eyes again. "He stayed in the courtyard for a long time after you were done talking." Bren said he stood there for almost an hour before he went back inside. Annie tied off the bandage and said nothing. "Bren said he was looking at the spear," Eli added. She did not see Caius that day, nor the day after. She was aware of him the way you become aware of weather in a place you have never lived before. Not through direct experience, but through the way everything else behaved around the fact of him. Guards straightened fractionally when passing certain corridors. Servants moved with slightly more efficiency near the main hall. Conversations in the East Wing common areas stopped and restarted at a different pitch when his name came up, which it did constantly, always with the slight tonal adjustment of people who were aware they were discussing someone who could hear through walls if he chose to. She focused on Eli. It was easy to focus on Eli. By the 3rd day, he was sitting up on his own and had opinions about everything she gave him to eat. By the 4th day, he had started asking her questions while she worked. Not the careful, testing questions of the first morning, but the relentless, cascading questions of a child who had been kept too quiet for too long and had a great deal of stored curiosity to discharge. What was cedar oil made from? Whether it was true that certain herbs grew only in moonlight. Whether she had ever treated a wolf in full shift. Whether wolves in full shift could still understand human speech, or whether it was like being a different creature entirely. "I don't know," she said to that last one. "I've never been in full shift myself." Eli went quiet in a way that suggested he was recalibrating something. "You're not a wolf?" "No." Then how did you get into the stronghold? He said it with pure curiosity, no cruelty in it. The way children ask things that adults have learned to keep quiet. Human healers don't usually come inside the walls. Your stable hand sent for me instead of the court physicians, Annie said. And your uncle let me stay. Eli absorbed this. Then, Bren says Uncle Caius doesn't usually let humans pass the outer gate. Annie kept her eyes on the herb bundles she was sorting. I know. So why did he let you? She tied a bundle of dried rosemary with a strip of cord. You'd have to ask him that. She was in the herb stores on the 5th evening, working by candlelight because the sky had closed over early, and the room had gone dim before she finished her inventory, when she heard the door open behind her. She knew before she turned. The quality of the silence that entered with him was different from everyone else's. Caius stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, and looked at her among the hanging bundles and labeled jars with an expression she was beginning, slowly, to be able to read. It was the expression he used when he was deciding how much of something to say. He ate dinner tonight, he said. On his own. He argued about the broth. Good, Annie said. Arguing about broth is a healthy sign. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough that she registered it. He stepped inside, and the room was not small, but became more concentrated with him in it, the way rooms did. He looked at the shelves, the dried bundles, the neat rows of jars she had reorganized over the past 2 days. Dorian tells me you rearranged the entire East Wing stores, he said. They were organized by color, Annie said, which is decorative but not functional. I reorganized them by use and preparation time. The physician's assistant was apparently distressed by this. The physician's assistant can find everything faster now. He'll recover. That almost smile again. She was starting to understand that for Caius, it was the equivalent of a laugh. He picked up a small jar from the shelf nearest him and looked at it. Dried bark chips, dark and rough. What is this? Slippery elm. Good for throat inflammation and digestive pain. She paused. Also useful for arrow wounds, if the shaft has been removed, and the interior tissue needs to be calmed before it closes. He set the jar down. You know a great deal about arrow wounds for a healer who doesn't live in a stronghold. I lived near the border for 2 years, Annie said. There were enough wounded passing through that I learned what I needed to. He turned to look at her properly. This was the thing about Caius that she had not anticipated and still had not entirely adjusted to. The way he looked at people. Most people of his rank looked past others, or through them, or at the space slightly above their heads. Caius looked directly. It was not aggressive. It was simply complete. The attention of someone who had decided that looking at a thing properly was worth doing. Where are you from? He asked. Originally, the Eastern settlements. Small pack territory, no alpha worth naming. My mother was a healer before me. She kept her voice even. She died when I was 16. I've been moving since then. Moving toward what? The question surprised her. People usually asked where she had come from, where she was going, not what she was moving toward wherever someone needed what I had. She said after a moment. He was quiet for a beat. The candle between them shifted in a draft from the doorway, sending shadows moving slowly across the shelves. Eli asked me today why I dropped my spear, Caius said. Annie went still. What did you tell him? I told him I wasn't sure yet. His eyes stayed on her face. That wasn't entirely true. The air in the room had changed texture. Annie was aware of the distance between them. 2 meters, perhaps slightly less. And the particular quality of his attention, which had always been substantial, but was now something else. Something more precisely directed. You were crying, he said. When I came into the courtyard, not loudly. You probably weren't aware of it. She had not been aware of it. She said nothing. I have seen healers work before. Caius continued, his voice remaining that same low, calibrated register. Many of them. In field camps, in courtrooms, in my brother's sick room before he died. A pause. None of them have ever wept for a patient they had never met before. While still working. Without stopping. It's not a skill, Annie said quietly. It's just something that happens, I know, he said. That's why I dropped the spear. She looked at him. He looked at her. The candle moved again. "There is something else," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, carrying the careful weight of someone approaching ground they had thought about for several days. "Your scent." He stopped. "What about it?" "It's familiar in a way it should not be." He said it as though the words were being drawn out of him against some preference for silence. "I have been trying to locate the memory since the first night. I cannot. But it is there." Annie felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately categorize. "I've never been in this stronghold before." "I know." His jaw shifted slightly. "That's what I cannot explain." Outside, the wind came up suddenly through the courtyard, sending a thin whistle through the narrow store's window. The flame between them guttered and held. Then Soren appeared in the doorway, solid and scarred, and carrying the expression of a man delivering news he had already decided not to soften. "Council needs you," he said to Caius. His eyes moved to Annie, brief and assessing, the way Soren's gaze always moved, gathering information and filing it without visible reaction. "There's been a border incident, north side." Caius held Annie's gaze for one more second. Then he turned. "We continue this," he said. Not a question. He left. Soren followed, pulling the door halfway closed behind him. Annie stood in the candlelit storeroom among the hanging herbs for a long moment, one hand resting on the shelf beside her, without her having noticed she had reached for it. She stayed there until her heartbeat returned to something resembling normal. Then she went back to work. The border incident kept Caius away for 3 days. Annie knew this not because anyone told her directly, but because the stronghold had a particular atmosphere when he was absent. A slight loosening, the way a room feels after a window is opened, except in reverse. Without him, the halls were louder, the guards less precise, the general movement of the place slightly less purposeful. She noticed it the way she noticed changes in a patient's breathing, automatically, without deciding to. She focused on Eli. By the 6th day, he was walking short distances on his own, shuffling to the window to look out at the courtyard with his hands pressed against the sill and his nose lifted slightly the way wolves did when they were reading the air. His appetite had returned fully, and with considerable enthusiasm. He had begun to talk about his father, not consistently, not with any narrative structure, but in the way grief surfaces in children, through sudden unannounced openings that close just as quickly. "My father used to bring me to the training yard," he said one morning while Annie was checking the wound, which was closing cleanly now, the skin knitting without infection. "He said a wolf who doesn't know how to fall will break every time he fights." "Your father was right," Annie said. "Do you know how to fall?" "I know how to roll," she said. "My mother taught me. She said a healer who gets hurt trying to help someone is a problem for everyone." Eli considered this. "Your mother sounds like she was smart." "She was the smartest person I've ever known." Annie tied off the fresh bandage. "She also made the worst soup in the eastern settlements, completely without shame about it." Eli laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that children have when they have forgotten for a moment to be careful, open and unguarded and a little surprised by itself. She stored that sound carefully, the way she stored things she wanted to remember. Mara came on the 7th morning with Annie's remaining belongings from the cottage. 2 more changes of clothing, a worn journal, a small wooden box containing the tools Annie's mother had left her. She set everything on the bed with the competent efficiency of someone who had packed and unpacked in difficult circumstances before, and then sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at Annie with the expression that meant she had been holding something back and had reached the limit of her patience for doing so. "People in the lower town are talking," Mara said. "People in the lower town are always talking. About you specifically." Mara laced her fingers together. "There are 2 versions. In the first one, you're a human healer who got lucky, and the king took pity on you. In the second one," she paused. "In the second one, people are saying you carry something in your blood that hasn't been seen in a long time." Annie looked up from the box she was unpacking. "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains why 3 Alpha brothers all turned up in a servant's courtyard in the middle of the night." Mara's voice was careful now, the exasperation set aside. "Annie, You know I've known you since you were 17, and crying over a wounded fox in the road outside your mother's cottage. I know you better than anyone, and I need to ask you something directly." "Then ask it." "Did your mother ever tell you who your father was?" The question settled in the room like a stone dropped in water. Annie set down the small wooden box. "She said he was a traveler," Annie said. "A wolf passing through. She said he was kind and then he was gone." "Did she say anything else? Did she ever say anything about his pack? His lineage?" "No." Annie's voice was steady, but her hands had stilled completely. "Why?" Mara reached into the front of her vest and produced a folded piece of paper, which she held out without speaking. Annie took it, unfolded it. It was a rough sketch, not professionally drawn, but rendered with enough accuracy to be recognizable. A symbol. A crest of some kind, 2 wolves facing each other across a vertical line, with a crescent beneath them. Around the outer edge, text in the old script that Annie could read only partially, the dialect too archaic for full translation. But the central words were clear enough. House of the First Blood, undivided. Annie stared at it. "Where did you get this?" "From old Petra in the lower town. She was your mother's midwife. She kept it. She said your mother gave it to her for safekeeping and told her to give it to you when you were ready." Mara paused. "Petra says she's been waiting for the right moment for 6 years. What does it mean?" "It means," Mara said slowly, "that your mother may not have been entirely honest about the traveler who was kind and then gone." She met Annie's eyes. The House of the First Blood was the original unified pack line. Before the split, before the 6 territories, before any of the current bloodlines established themselves, they were thought to be extinct. The last recorded member died 40 years ago. Annie looked at the sketch for a long time. "Or," Mara said quietly, "one of them had a daughter in a small settlement in the east and didn't tell her." She was sitting with this information, turning it over in the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath, when Soren found her in the corridor outside Eli's room late that afternoon. He said nothing for a moment, simply fell into step beside her with the unhurried confidence of someone who did not require an invitation to occupy space. "The king returns tonight," he said. "I know," Annie said. She had felt the change in the stronghold's atmosphere 2 hours ago, the slight tightening that preceded his arrival. Soren walked beside her in silence for several steps. This was, she had learned, characteristic. Soren did not fill spaces with words. When he spoke, it was because something needed saying. "There will be a gathering tonight," he said. "The border matter requires a formal assembly of the pack lieutenants. Full hall. That has nothing to do with me," Annie said. "You will be expected to attend." She stopped walking. "Why?" Soren stopped as well and looked at her with those level, scar-marked features. "Because my brother asked for you to be present." A pause. "Because Aldrich will be there." The name meant something. She could see it was supposed to. She filed it and kept her voice neutral. "Who is Aldrich?" "The alpha of the northern border pack. The one who found Eli on the slope and sent him to us." Soren's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility, but with the particular focus of someone deciding how much context to provide. "He has been making a formal claim. He says the boy fell on his territory, which creates an obligation under pack law. He's been pushing the argument for a week. Tonight he intends to press it in the full hall." Annie felt something cold move through her chest. "He's claiming guardianship over Eli?" "He's claiming a right of proximity," Soren said. "It's a legal distinction, but the practical result is the same. He would have authority to remove the boy from this stronghold. Eli is 8 years old and barely healed from a chest wound," Annie said, and her voice had sharpened without her deciding it should. "Yes," Soren said. Simply, without additional commentary, in the way he sometimes agreed with something to let the speaker hear what they had just said. "Why does Caius want me there?" she asked. "Because Aldrich will use the boy's condition as evidence of negligence. Eli's continued illness under the court physician's care." Another pause. "You are the evidence that the negligence has been addressed, but Caius will not put you there as a prop." Soren looked at her steadily. "He wants you there because he wants you there. There is a difference." She held his gaze. Soren was not a man who softened things. which meant what he had just said was as straightforward as it sounded. "What time?" she asked. The great hall was the largest room in the stronghold, with stone arches spanning the ceiling and torches in iron brackets lining both walls in double rows. The pack banners hung between them, deep green and black, the sigil of Caius's line at the center, the secondary pack marks flanking it on both sides. The long tables had been pushed to the walls, and the lieutenants stood in 2 lines down the center of the room, 12 men total, each carrying the dense contained energy of high-ranking wolves in a formal situation. Aldrich stood at the far end. Annie assessed him from across the room with the clinical habit she applied to everything. He was broad, gray at the temples, with a face built for authority and eyes that moved around a room the way a man's eyes move when he is calculating weight and leverage. He had brought 3 of his own men. They stood slightly behind him and to the sides in the configuration of wolves who were prepared for something to escalate. He looked at Annie when she entered, and she felt the assessment, quick, comprehensive and dismissive, the look of a man cataloging something he did not consider a serious variable. She had been underestimated by better men than Aldrich. She found a place to stand near the east wall and waited. Caius entered from the north door. He had come directly from the road. She could see it in the faint dust on his boots, the slightly wind-roughened set of his jaw. He had not changed clothes, which she suspected was deliberate. He walked to the head of the room without looking at anyone specifically, which somehow made every person in the room feel individually acknowledged, and stood with his hands at his sides and waited for the room to settle. It settled immediately. Aldrich made his case with the smooth efficiency of someone who had prepared it carefully. The border territory, the obligations under proximity law. The boy's documented poor health under current arrangements, his own pack's resources, the space, the stability. He spoke for several minutes without looking at Annie. Then Caius said, "The boy's health is no longer a concern." Aldrich paused. "With respect, the record of the past 14 months is 14 months old as of this week," Caius said. "His current condition is the relevant information." Aldrich's eyes moved to Annie. "I'm told a human healer has been brought inside the walls." The inflection on human was slight but present, carrying the weight of a question about judgment. "This seems an irregular solution." "It is an effective one," Caius said. "A child of alpha blood requires wolfkin care," Aldrich said, and now his voice had the edge of someone pressing a point they had prepared for resistance. "The old customs are clear on this." The room was very still. Annie felt it before she understood it. A shift in the air, a change in the density of the silence. And then Dorian, who had been standing quietly to the left, produced the folded paper with the practiced casualness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and held it out toward the center of the room. "An interesting point about customs," Dorian said pleasantly. "Perhaps we should discuss lineage while we're here." Aldrich looked at the paper. Something moved in his expression. "That symbol," Soren said from the right side of the room, his flat voice carrying without effort, "was found among the effects of the healer's mother, who was from the eastern settlements, whose father's line has not been traced." He let the silence sit for exactly 1 beat. Until now. Annie stood very still against the east wall. Caius turned and looked at her from across the room. In the torchlight, his amber eyes were very clear. He was not asking for her permission, but he was looking at her, she realized, the way he had looked at her in the servants' courtyard on the first night, as though whatever was in her was something he had recognized before he had proof. "The house of the first blood," Caius said to the room, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone stating a fact rather than making an argument, "does not require wolfkin validation. It is the original blood. Everything else traces back to it." Aldrich stared at the paper, then at Annie, then at Caius. The 3 men he had brought with him exchanged a brief glance that said, without words, that the ground had moved under them and they were deciding how to stand on it. "This has not been verified," Aldrich said. His voice had lost its edge. "It will be," Caius said. "Tonight, this conversation ends. The matter of the boy is closed." It was not a discussion. It was the end of one. Aldrich looked at Annie one more time. The dismissiveness was gone. In its place was something more complicated. The recalibration of a man who had walked into a room certain of his leverage and discovered it had already been removed. He inclined his head, slightly, stiffly. It was enough. The hall emptied slowly after Aldrich left. The lieutenants filed out in the particular order of men who wanted to discuss what they had just witnessed, but were smart enough to wait until they were out of earshot. Dorian watched them go with his hands clasped behind his back, and the expression of someone thoroughly satisfied with how an evening had unfolded. Soren had already disappeared. Soren always disappeared when the formal part of things ended, as though ceremony was a coat he wore only as long as strictly necessary. Annie stayed where she was against the east wall, until the room was nearly empty. Then she moved toward the door. Annie. She stopped. Caius had not moved from the head of the room. The torches on either side of him cast long shadows across the stone floor, and he stood in the overlap of two pools of light with his hands at his sides, looking at her with that complete, direct attention that she had stopped trying to deflect 2 days ago. She turned back. The room was empty now except for the two of them. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard, with the particular low sound it made when the temperature had dropped below freezing. "You should have told me," she said. "About the crest. About what Dorian and Soren had found." "I found out this morning," he said. "On the road, by messenger. And you used it tonight without asking me." "Yes," he said. Without apology, but without defensiveness either, simply acknowledging it as a fact. She looked at him. "It may not even be accurate. One old woman's kept paper in a midwife's memory. It will be verified. There are records in the archive that trace the first bloodline through the eastern settlements." He paused. "I had them pulled before I left for the border, before the paper was found." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because of your scent," he said. "I told you it was familiar in a way it should not have been. I needed to understand why." Something moved across his face, careful and deliberate. The first bloodline carries a marker. In the old records, it's described as cedar and rain-washed stone after a storm, something that predates any individual pack scent. The herb stores, the cedar oil she had pressed herself. She had never thought of it as anything other than a practical preference. "Caius," she said, and using his name directly felt like stepping onto ice she had not tested, but she did it anyway. "I am a healer from a small settlement with a basket of dried herbs and a dead mother who kept secrets. Whatever those records say, I am not—" "I know what you are," he said. It was not an interruption exactly. It was the voice of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say a thing precisely. "I know what you are," he said again, quieter, "because I watched you work for 4 days before I spoke to you properly. I watched you sit through 2 nights on a stone floor, so a child who had never met you would not wake up alone. I watched you reorganize a storage room that no one asked you to reorganize, because the disorganization bothered you on behalf of future patients who did not exist yet." He took 1 step toward her. "I watched you stand in a formal hall tonight in front of 12 pack lieutenants and a territorial alpha who looked at you like you were nothing, and you stood there like you were something. Because you are." Annie said nothing. The torchlight moved. "I dropped the spear," he said, "because I have spent 12 years building something. 6 territories, a unified code, a stronghold that functions, a pack that holds. 12 years of knowing exactly what every decision costs and making it anyway. Another step. I have not been surprised by anything in a very long time, and you surprised me." "I kissed a child's forehead," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "You wept for a child you had never met and kept working." He stopped a meter from her. "That is not a small thing. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen in a room full of people who are supposed to care." The silence between them was different from all the previous silences. Those had been full of things being held back. This one was full of things that had been said. "I don't know what I am," Annie said honestly. "I don't know what the records will say. I don't know what the crest means for my life or my work or any of it. I have spent 6 years moving toward wherever someone needed me, and I have never once stopped to think about what I was moving toward for myself." "Then stop now," he said. "Think about it now." She looked at him, at the amber eyes that held their own light, at the jaw that carried tension even in stillness, at the man who had held 6 territories together for 12 years. and had dropped his spear in a servant's courtyard because of something he saw in her that she was only beginning to see in herself. Eli, she said, he needs consistency. He needs the same person every morning until he is fully healed. That takes months. I know, Caius said. And after he's healed, he'll still need someone who doesn't leave. I know that too. I'm not saying this as a condition, she said carefully. I'm saying it because it is the truest thing I know how to say right now. Whatever else this is, she gestured slightly between them, because naming it directly felt like too much before she had examined it properly. Eli comes first. Yes, Caius said simply, and the simplicity of it was more than she expected, more than the men in her life had generally managed, which, admittedly, was not a long list, but was long enough to establish a pattern. He was always going to come first. That's not a negotiation. That is simply what is true. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I need to think. Take the time you need. You're not going to push. No, he said. I'm not going to push. She nodded. Turned toward the door. Annie. She stopped for the second time. The archive records, he said. They will confirm the lineage. I am certain of it. But I want you to understand that it does not change what I said. The records are not why. A pause. The weight of a man being as precise as language allows. The courtyard was why. She left the hall with that sitting in her chest like a coal that had no intention of going out. The records confirmed it within the week. 3 archivists working across 2 days produced the documentation, with the slightly dazed efficiency of people who had located something they had been told did not exist. The line was clear. Annie's mother had been the granddaughter of the last recorded First Blood heir, born outside the formal record to a woman who had left the Pact territories before the final dissolution and spent the rest of her life making sure no one knew. Annie sat with the documents for a long time in the East Wing room, the fire burning low. The wooden box her mother had left her open on the table beside the papers. Inside the box, beneath the tools she had used for 6 years, was a small folded letter she had read 100 times. Her mother had written it when Annie was 12, in the handwriting that slanted left, because her mother had broken her right wrist twice and reset it imperfectly. She had always told Annie it was simply a letter of advice. Keep moving. Keep giving what you have. Don't wait for the world to tell you what you're worth. She had not thought, until now, that it might also have been an apology. Mara came and sat beside her without speaking, and put an arm around her shoulders, and they stayed like that for a while in front of the low fire. Are you all right? Mara asked eventually. I think so, Annie said. I think I will be. And the king? Annie looked at the documents on the table, at the crest, at her mother's letter beside it. He waited, she said. He said he would not push, and he didn't. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of a woman who had spent 23 years saying true things to Annie, regardless of whether they were comfortable. That is, in my experience, extremely rare. I know, Annie said. She went to him the following evening. Not ceremonially, not with any of the formal architecture that Pact tradition apparently allowed for, and which Dorian had cheerfully outlined to her in unnecessary detail over breakfast. She went the way she did everything, directly, with clear intention, and without excess decoration. She found him in the outer courtyard, alone, running through the slow, deliberate forms of the training practice she had seen him do twice before at dawn. He stopped when he heard her approach and turned, and the amber eyes found her immediately in the low evening light. She crossed the courtyard and stopped in front of him. I've thought about it, she said. He waited. I'm not going to pretend to understand everything the records mean yet, she said, or what it will require of me going forward. I don't know what I don't know, and I am honest about that. She held his gaze. But I know this place. I know Eli. I know the herb stores, and I know the East Wing corridor, and I know the sound of this courtyard in the morning. A pause. And I know you. Not completely, but enough to know that I want to. Caius looked at her for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not as a claim, not as a demonstration, but the way you take hold of something you have been careful with and intend to continue being careful with, and held it in both of his. Then stay, he said. She did. Aldrich never filed another claim. The matter of the border territories was settled formally 3 months later, with boundaries drawn and obligations codified and signed by all 6 PAC representatives. He attended the signing, acknowledged Caius at the head of the table, and looked at Annie once. A look that had shed every trace of its original dismissiveness, and carried instead the complicated respect of a man who had been wrong about something significant and knew it. Annie did not particularly need his respect, but she noted its presence with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. Eli healed fully by early spring. The wound closed clean, the recurring fevers did not return, and he grew 2 inches before summer in the way of children whose bodies have finally been given what they needed to catch up. He followed Annie through the herb stores for months after he no longer required treatment, asking questions she answered with the same unhurried directness she had applied from the first morning. He would grow up in the stronghold, surrounded by people who would not leave, and he would know how to fall without breaking, because Annie taught him that too. Mara moved her own belongings into the East Wing 3 weeks after Annie, on the grounds that someone had to keep track of things, and stayed. Dorian declared this the best development in the stronghold's recent history, and marked the occasion with a level of ceremony that no one had requested, and everyone was somewhat glad of anyway. Soren said nothing, but Annie found a fresh supply of cedar oil outside her store's door one morning, with no indication of who had left it, and she knew. The verification of the first blood lineage moved through the PAC territories like water finding level. Slowly at first, then all at once. There were those who contested it, as there always are when something inconveniently true disrupts a settled order. They were met with the documented record, with Caius's complete and unambiguous support, and with the particular quality of stillness that Annie had developed over 6 years of moving through difficult places without apology. What she had been told was nobody's story turned out to have been a very old story all along. On the morning of the formal recognition, the ceremony in the Great Hall where the PAC lieutenants would acknowledge the lineage before witnesses and the Stronghold's records would be permanently amended, Annie stood in the East Wing room and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The dress Mara had sourced for the occasion was dark green wool with silver thread at the collar, simple and well made. Her hair was pinned back the way she liked it, practical first and everything else second. Caius found her there before the ceremony, which she suspected he had planned, and stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in. He carried something in his hand, a small carved wooden thing, a wolf in mid-stride, smoothed by years of handling. "This was my brother's," he said. He would hold it when he was deciding something. He held it out. "I thought you might want something in your hand this morning, in case it helps." She looked at the carved wolf, then she took it. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not what it's for. It's just something to hold." She looked at him. At this man who had spent 12 years holding 6 territories together, and had stood in a cold courtyard, and watched a woman weep for a child she had never met, and had let it change something in him, and had waited, and had not pushed. And she understood that what she had been moving toward, across 6 years and all those difficult places, had not been a destination she could have named in advance. It had simply been this. She closed her hand around the carved wolf and walked with him into the hall. Outside the stronghold walls, the pine forest caught the early light the way it always did in the cold months, slowly, carefully, as though the morning were something worth taking time over. Inside, the hall filled with sound and witness and the permanent weight of things being made real. Annie stood at the front of it, in the place that had always been hers, and finally knew it.